quiet Montana morning broke the same as always, until a sudden rustle shattered the calm. "Doctor." Ethan Cole froze as a wild bobcat leapt through his window, snow scattering behind her. In her jaws, she carried a fragile kitten. Their eyes met, one filled with instinct, the other with disbelief, and in that heartbeat, silence became connection. The morning lay quiet over the Montana ridge, a slow blue light resting on snow and pine. Inside the small wooden cabin, Doctor Ethan Cole wrapped his hands around a chipped mug of coffee, listening to the soft ticking of the stove, the wind brushing against the glass, and the familiar, heavy silence of a man who had grown used to being alone. He had once woken to frantic calls, sirens, the rush of emergency clinics, and wild eyes brought in on stretchers. Now, his mornings were measured, the creak of floorboards, the crackle of kindling, the slow pool of breath. Outside, the world was buried deep in white, and he watched it with the distant calm of someone who no longer expected surprises. A faint scrape broke through the quiet. At first it folded into the wind, easy to dismiss. Then it came again, sharper, closer, a deliberate drag along the cabin wall. Ethan set his mug down, listening. The stove hummed, the clock ticked. Another rustle at the window, lower this time, as if something was testing the edge between out there and in here. Before he could move, the sound exploded, a sudden clatter of claws on the outer ledge, the soft thump of weight against glass. Ethan turned just as the curtain trembled. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the old latch shuddered. The window gave an inch, and winter air slipped in, cold and thin, carrying with it a smell that did not belong indoors. She came through like a pulled breath. A wild bobcat, mottled fur dusted with frost, muscles coiled and silent, eyes the colour of amber stone. She cleared the sill in one fluid motion, landing soft on the wooden floor. Between her jaws, hanging limp but unhurt, was a tiny bobcat kitten, fur still puffed and newborn soft, paws dangling like loose threads. Ethan froze. The room shrank to the sound of his own heartbeat, a low thud against his ribs. Instinct told him to step back, to grab something, to push her out, slam the window shut. But the cat's gaze pinned him where he stood, not wild chaos, not blind hunger, but a fierce, focused purpose that made every sudden movement feel like it would be a mistake. She lowered the kitten to the floor with delicate care, never taking her eyes off him. The little body twitched, gave a weak, squeaking breath, then curled closer to her foreleg. Ethan noticed how thin the mother was, ribs faintly visible beneath her winter coat, a patch of singed fur along her shoulder that caught the light like an old scar. She had not come here by accident. Snow-laced wind still slipped through the open gap. Ethan took a slow breath and shifted sideways. Not closer, just enough to reach the window frame. The bobcat's ears twitched. Her whiskers flared. For a suspended second, predator and man stood inside the same fragile circle of decision. Then he eased the window shut behind her, sealing all three of them away from the storm. The stove's glow painted a soft halo across the floorboards where the kitten lay. The mother bobcat nudged it closer to the faint warmth, then turned her head toward Ethan again. Pupils narrow, chest rising and falling with quiet control. He saw no panic, no plan to flee, only a question: what kind of man was he going to be in this moment? He moved with deliberate gentleness, palms open, keeping his height small, his steps slow. He dragged an old wool blanket from the back of a chair and set it near, but not touching. Their chosen corner. The bobcat tracked every motion, muscles like wire under her fur. Yet she did not strike. The air thinned with the weight of unspoken terms, neither of them fully understood. Ethan knelt at a safe distance, knees complaining against the wooden floor. Up close, he saw the ash mark on her coat, the uneven fur at her flank. A memory stirred, a night of smoke and orange sky. A young wild cat carried from the edge of fire, slipping from his hands before he could help. He swallowed. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was her. The thought pressed against him anyway. The kitten shivered once, then pressed into its mother's belly. The bobcat curled her body around it, tail wrapping like a shield. She blinked slowly, a measured, sovereign gesture that felt more like a verdict than a threat. Ethan exhaled. Finally, the tension slipping from his shoulders as if released on her permission. The cabin, once empty, felt strangely full. Outside, the wind clawed at the eaves, throwing fine snow against the glass. Inside, 3 lives shared one pool of fragile warmth. Ethan settled back onto his chair, but did not pick up his mug. His eyes stayed on the bobcat and her tiny bundle, aware that some invisible line had just been crossed. He didn't know why she had chosen his window. He only knew nothing about this winter would be ordinary again. The storm eased into a dull white hush that wrapped the cabin like wool. By late morning, Ethan moved through his routines on careful feet, pretending nothing had changed, while every sense circled back to the wild mother in the corner. Willow lay coiled around her kitten, eyes open, guarding both the newborn and the doorway to escape. She had not looked away from him for long. Not once. Even when the kitten twitched and pressed closer, some part of her focus stayed pinned on the man, measuring each shift of his shoulders, each scrape of his boots. To her, walls were as dangerous as open sky. She had chosen this room, but choice never meant safety. Ethan brewed coffee, the bitter scent slipping softly through the air, mingling with wood smoke and damp fur. He set his mug farther than usual from his chair, giving her space as if drawing a line she owned. Willow's nose lifted, reading him the way she read, whined, no blood, no trap, only tired bones and steady hands. He spoke once, quiet enough to be harmless. You picked a stubborn house. Girl. His voice drifted over the floorboards, low and unthreatening. Willow's ears twitched, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement. She did not know his words, only the weight behind them, the lack of sharp edges. Tone, in her world, was its own language. A stray draft slid under the door, carrying the metallic cold of deep snow and distant pine. Willow's muscles tightened instantly, tail flicking toward the sound, mind-mapping exits. But when the kitten whimpered, she pulled it closer and stayed pressed against the warm boards. Outside was familiar. Inside meant survival, at least for today. Ethan eased down to one knee several feet away. joints protesting. Slowly, he spread a wool blanket, folding it thick, its fringe brushing the floor. He never reached toward her, never met her eyes like a challenge. Willow watched every motion, whiskers forward, until his hands withdrew. Only then did her shoulders loosen a breath. The kitten nosed blindly along her belly, guided by heat and smell, latching with a tiny, desperate insistence. Willow shifted just enough to help it find what it sought. In that movement, all the masks of predator fell away. She was only a mother who had carried this fragile life through cold and hunger to this fragile room. The cabin, so long built around Ethan's silence, redrew itself around them. From his worn chair, he studied the mottled lines of her coat, the faint patch of burned fur along her shoulder, the memory of a young bobcat stumbling from smoke brushed against him, half-formed. If she was the same, she had not forgotten who hadn't hurt her. Time thinned into quieter measurements, the soft tick of the stove, the kitten's uneven breaths, the almost inaudible grind of Willow's claws, flexing and relaxing against the boards. With each passing minute, she blinked slower when he moved, less like a creature braced to spring, more like one updating old calculations about danger. Afternoon light faded early, turning the snowy clearing outside into a grey sea. The wind clawed at the eaves, rattling loose ice. Each gust tugged at Willow's instincts, calling her back to tree line and stone. She rose halfway once, body angled toward the window, then looked down at the kitten and sank back into the blanket's edge. When he slid a shallow bowl of water a little closer, the sound made her head snap up. Thirst won the argument with fear. Willow crept forward, keeping her body between Ethan and her young, and drank in short, wary pulls. She returned to the kitten without turning her back. Yet something invisible between them had shifted a degree. That small act of acceptance settled heavy in Ethan's chest. Wild things did not remain where terror outweighed need. She had crossed his window with her most precious burden and stayed. He understood it as the closest thing to a question she could ask. Would this stranger under her roof stand between them and the cold, or not? Night finally sealed itself against the glass, the stove casting a muted amber pool across their corner. Willow curled tight, the kitten buried in her fur, her breaths lengthening into real sleep. Ethan watched over them from his chair, blanket on his knees, feeling his cabin change shape around the promise he had silently made. Morning slid in pale and thin, tracing a dull silver edge along the window. The storm had passed, but the cold still clung to the glass. Willow woke first. Her ears turned to the quiet, measuring a world that no longer howled. The man still sat in his chair, half asleep, his scent unchanged. The kitten pressed against her belly, alive, warm. For now, that was enough. She rose with slow care, testing each muscle like a hunter after a long chase. Pain tugged along the old scar on her shoulder, that jagged line of burned fur that winter never let her forget. She stretched over the blanket Ethan had laid down and inhaled. The wool carried smoke, pine, and something gentler beneath, the worn patience of this cabin's only human. In her memory, smoke had not smelled gentle. It had poured over the ridge in thick waves, turning trees into shadows and burrows into traps. The young bobcat she had been once had stumbled through a world of orange and choking ash. A human shape had appeared in that blur, a pair of steady hands, a low voice, cool water on burned skin, then darkness, then escape. She had run, but she had remembered. Now those same hands moved again, unarmed, reaching only for the kettle. The clang of metal on stove made her muscles bunch, then ease when nothing followed. He kept his distance, shoulders turned, head dipped, never pinning her with his stare. He recognized something in her scar, just as she recognized something in his restraint. The past threaded softly between them, while he poured fresh water into a chipped bowl and nudged it closer. Willow watched with a stillness carved from long seasons of survival. Her world had taught her that human scent meant traps, steel, sudden endings. Yet this one had once carried her out of fire. He had let her go. A creature who lets go becomes a different kind of danger or a different kind of shelter. The kitten squirmed away from her for the first time, front paws dragging, nose searching blindly over the blanket's rough weave. A flicker of alarm cut through Willow's chest. she stepped forward, placing her body between the little wanderer and the open room. The man did not move toward them. He simply waited, hands loose at his sides, letting her decide the boundaries. In that small pause, Ethan saw it clearly, the way her head tilted, the way her weight shifted, the flash of recognition in those amber eyes when his voice slipped into the same low cadence he'd used years ago in the smoke. He did not say her name, he had never had one for her then, but now, quietly, he gave her one. "You're Willow," he murmured. The word floated without demand. Names meant nothing to her. Yet something in the sound carried no threat. Willow turned her head slightly, acknowledging only that he had spoken and nothing terrible had followed. The kitten found her paw and collapsed against it, tired from its small expedition. Willow lowered herself, curling back around that fragile body, but her gaze drifted once more to the man by the stove. Outside, the ridge stood silent, pines heavy with last night's burden. Tracks around the cabin already blurred into soft dents. Predators and men would read this place differently now. To Willow, the cabin had become a den drawn on borrowed lines, owned by neither of them, held together by a bargain made in glances instead of claws and guns. Ethan sipped his coffee, feeling the weight of that invisible agreement. He understood wild fear. He had seen it in exam rooms and roadside ditches. But trust from something that owed him nothing that was rarer. The scar on her flank felt like proof his choice during the fire still echoed. She had come back not by mistake, but by memory. Midday light began to soften the hard edges of the room. Willow left the kitten only long enough to lap from the bowl he'd offered. Muscles coiled in case the world changed its mind about kindness. It didn't. She returned, brushed her cheek along the kitten's spine, and for the first time allowed her side to face him, no longer guarding every angle. The emotional distance between them narrowed without ceremony. No dramatic gesture, no sudden touch, just the quiet pattern of repeated safety, no traps when she blinked, no shouting when she shifted, no reaching for what was hers. It was the sort of slow, ordinary grace that wild things believed more than any single grand act. As evening seeped back into the rafters, Willow settled deeper into the blanket's circle. The kitten anchored against her ribs, The cabin hummed with low firelight and unspoken terms. She had chosen this place once before in catastrophe and fled. This time, she had chosen it carrying life in her jaws. And as the man watched over them without claiming them, she let her eyes fall shut, trusting the dark on his side of the room too. Dawn came thin and colourless. A soft grey washed over the drifts beyond the window. Inside, the cabin held its fragile truce. Willow lay curved around her kitten on the folded wool, fur rising and falling with each slow breath. Ethan moved lightly, careful not to jolt the quiet, aware that every scrape of chair or clink of mug still ran through her like a test. She woke before his footsteps truly began, eyes opening to a world she had already mapped. The human was where she had left him, upright but small, offering warmth that did not bite. The kitten shifted at her belly, stronger now, its tiny paws pressing into her as it searched. Willow nosed the little body once, memorizing its scent again. One life saved was not enough. Beyond the cabin, the mountain exhaled a brutal cold. Willow's ears tracked the silence outside. No storm, but a hardness in the air that meant predators were hungry and shelter was scarce. Somewhere out there, in a hollow she had used before, another kitten waited, weaker than this one, its heartbeat counting down in the snow. The choice that had felt impossible yesterday returned. She rose suddenly. The motion made Ethan straighten, heart stuttering. Willow stepped over the sleeping kitten and padded toward the window. Each step measured, tail low but steady. At the glass, she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. Her gaze passed from the blanketed corner to the man, a silent handover. Then, with a quick spring, she slipped out into the white. The room felt abruptly larger without her, and colder, despite the stove's soft fire. Ethan crossed to the nest, kneeling a careful arm's length away. The kitten let out a thin cry, blindly pawing at the air where its mother's warmth had been. He didn't touch it. He only adjusted the blanket closer, building a small wall of softness against the draft, and hoped she understood why she had left it behind. Outside, Willow cut through the drifts along a path only she knew. the cold bit into the burned patch on her flank. Every step sent memory flickering flame. Smoke. That same human voice. She moved faster. Snow gathered on her whiskers, clung to her chest. Somewhere above the creek bed, the faint, broken scent of her other kitten rose through the frost like a fading call. She found the hollow half-caved, crusted with ice. Inside, the second kitten lay curled against frozen earth, breath shallow as a trapped bird. Willow slipped in, pressing her warm body around it. It stirred, but weakness dragged at its movements. There was no more time to weigh risk. She gripped it gently in her jaws. The wild did not often get a second chance. She was taking one. Ethan stood by the window now, eyes scanning the bleak line of trees. The minutes stretched too long, each one carving a deeper worry than he wanted to admit. Behind him, the lone kitten whimpered again, the sound small but insistent, like it understood its world hinged on a promise between species neither had spoken aloud. He whispered, "Come on, girl. Don't prove me wrong." A shadow broke from the tree line, a compact, determined shape bounding through powder. Willow's outline grew sharper with each leap. Something clutched carefully between her jaws. Ethan held his breath as she landed on the sill and pushed the window gap with her shoulder. She slipped inside in one practiced motion, the cold spiraling in with her. This time, she did not claim the farthest corner. Willow padded straight to the nest where the first kitten lay and set the second one down beside its sibling. It was smaller, its fur matted with ice, breaths thin and ragged. The stronger kitten nosed blindly toward it, as if answering some quiet call. Ethan watched the small reunion with a sting tightening his throat. Willow stood over both of them, sides heaving from the run, eyes burning with a fierce, exhausted fire. She looked at Ethan, not in challenge, not in plea, but in something heavier, older, recognition, calculation, trust, now tied to more than one fragile chest. When he knelt and inched the blanket closer, she didn't flinch. She let the softness come. The emotional peak passed not with a shout, but with the kitten's shallow cries growing a shade stronger as warmth returned. Willow curled around both, forming a living wall. Her tail brushed the edge of Ethan's folded wool, accepting the human scent as part of their den. Outside, the mountain remained unforgiving. Inside, a wild mother had chosen her ally. As evening lowered itself over the ridge, the cabin sank back into a quieter rhythm. Willow slept in brief, guarded stretches, waking to check each tiny heartbeat. Ethan tended the stove, listening to the soft chorus of breath behind him. The awe that had frozen him on that first morning remained, but it had changed shape, less shock now. More reverence for a trust he knew he had to protect. By late afternoon, the sky dimmed without warning, as if someone had pressed a palm over the sun. A hard wind rose from the ridge, dragging veils of snow sideways across the valley. Inside the cabin, the light turned the colour of tin. Willow lifted her head before the first real gust slammed the outer wall. She knew that sound. Storm. Ethan checked the forecast battery radio, though the mountain was already telling him more honestly. A blizzard warning. Temperatures dropping fast. He glanced to the corner where Willow curled around her kittens. They had grown, but not enough. Their bodies were still small flames that could be snuffed out by one long night of cold. Willow felt the pressure change bleed through the chinks in the wood. The kittens twitched closer to her belly, noses nudging through her fur. She pressed them tighter against her. Ears pricked at every vibration. Wind like this did not ask permission. It tore nests apart, stripped scent from the air, scattered the living if they weren't ready. When the power died, it went without drama, a brief flicker, then a flat surrender. The cabin sagged into a dim orange ring around the stove. Ethan moved quickly, feeding more wood into the firebox, counting in his head the hours of heat he could stretch. Outside, the storm's howl thickened, drowning even his thoughts. The cold pushed in under the door, slid along the floor like a living thing. Willow felt it touch her paws, snake toward her ribs. One kitten shivered so hard its head bumped against her chest. The other's mew was thin, uncertain. She lowered herself further, but the air kept stealing what little warmth their small bodies held. Ethan watched their huddled shape, a tight knot of fur and fear in the edge of the room. The stove's heat barely reached them now. He knew frostbite, knew lungs that slowed in the dark. If he did nothing, the storm would choose for him. But to move closer meant crossing a line they'd drawn carefully. Day by day, wind hammered the glass, rattling it in its frame. One kitten let out a broken sound and went limp for a breath too long. Willow jerked, licking its face, nudging its side in frantic repetition. For the first time since she'd entered his home, panic flared through her posture raw, unhidden, stripped of pride. It shook something loose inside him. Slowly, Ethan knelt and inched toward them, hands open. Willow snapped her head up, eyes burning, body forming a barrier over both kittens. A low growl rumbled out, warning layered with terror. For a moment they stared at each other, the man who had heat and the mother who had everything to lose. The storm roared, waiting. He didn't retreat. He softened his voice instead. That same tone from smoke-filled memories. "I'm not taking them," he whispered. "I'm bringing the fire closer." He picked up the folded wool and tugged it nearer the stove, then paused, letting her see his intent, leaving space for her to answer in the only way she could. Willow's gaze flicked to the kitten that had gone quiet, its sides barely moving. The cold clawed at her own limbs. Staying put meant letting the dark close its fist around them. She hissed once, not at him, but at the choice itself. Then, trembling, shifted just enough to let him slide the blanket beneath and nearer to the glow. When his hands brushed the edge of her fur, she did not strike. Every instinct screamed at her to drive him back. Yet she held still, trusting the pattern of all the moments he had not hurt her. Ethan carefully scooped one kitten, then the other, only inches, placing them in the deeper cradle of warmth. Willow followed, wrapping herself over them again. The new nest settled right in the reach of the stove's radiating heat. For long minutes, no one moved. The storm battered the cabin while 3 fragile heartbeats argued their case against it. Gradually, the weaker kitten's breathing strengthened, no longer scraping at the air. Willow's shoulders eased, though her eyes stayed on Ethan, glistening with a wild, reluctant gratitude, night sealed itself outside, swallowing the world beyond the glass. In the small circle of amber light, the Bobcat family slept in uneven shift, their lives now stitched to a human's fire. Ethan sat close by, blanket over his legs, listening to wind, flame, and fur breathing counterpoint. The crisis had peaked and passed. What remained was a quieter vow, unspoken, but binding. Morning returned like a quiet apology, laying a soft gold sheet across the snow. The glass that had rattled under the blizzard now only hummed with thin light. Inside, the cabin felt smaller and warmer, narrowed down to the circle near the stove where Willow lay draped over her kittens, their tiny sides rising with the easy rhythm of sleep she had nearly lost. She woke before they did, as she always had in the wild, ears catching every faint sound, nose testing the air. No biting draught now, no creeping cold along the floorboards, only wood smoke, human, wool, milk. Her gaze travelled to the man in the chair. He'd fallen asleep sitting up, boots still on, blanket half slipped, as if he'd guarded the fire all night. The kittens began to stir, noses nudging at her belly, claws flexing against her fur. She shifted to let them find what they needed. They latched with new strength, soft grumbles echoing against her chest. Storm danger had sharpened them. Surviving had a way of making even the smallest lives cling harder. Willow's shoulders loosened by a fraction. She had chosen well. Ethan woke to that sound, the small, insistent chorus of the living. He rubbed the stiffness from his neck and took in the scene, both kittens feeding. Willow alert, but no longer wound tight like a sprung trap. The blanket sat beneath them, warmed by the stove he'd tended. It looked less like an intrusion now, more like part of their den. He stepped into the kitchen corner, hands slow, movements deliberate. As he poured water and set a plate with a few scraps of cooked meat near her reach, Willow watched. But the old flinch had dulled. Hunger tugged harder than suspicion. She eased forward just enough to take what was offered, never leaving the kittens unshielded, but no longer bristling at his nearness. Late morning light spilled boulder across the floorboards, catching in the amber of her eyes. For the first time, Willow shifted so that one flank, scarred and uneven, faced him without defense. Ethan noticed, and the recognition cut quietly through him. This was the same body he'd pulled from smoke years ago. She was no ghost of that fire. She was its survivor. A truck's distant crunch over packed snow snapped the moment. Willow's head jerked up, ears high. The sound did not belong to wind or stream or elk. It was shorter, sharper, a human machine crawling the ridge road. The kittens twitched at her sudden tension. Ethan's jaw tightened. There was only one person who drove up here unannounced. The knock was soft but firm. Ethan opened the door to Ranger Henry Walker, cheeks red from the cold, uniform dusted with frost. Henry offered a half smile, then glanced past him and stopped. From the doorway, he saw what no regulation manual had prepared him for. A wild bobcat curled around two kittens on a folded blanket, mere feet from the stove. Willow rose, placing herself between the stranger and her young. Her body swelled larger, silent warning in every line. Henry instinctively froze, hand hovering but not reaching for the tranquilizer at his belt. "Ethan," he whispered, "you know what that is in your living room, right?" Ethan's reply was low. "I know exactly what she is, and what she's not." For a long beat, 3 lives held still while a 4th weighed them. Henry's eyes moved from the scar on Willow's flank to the kittens pressed into her belly, then to Ethan's tired face. Regulations said relocation, containment, reports. Reality said storm, survival. A mother who had chosen one roof over the dark. He let his hand drop away from the belt. "I'm not calling this in," Henry murmured at last. "But if anyone else finds out, it won't be my decision." His warning hung there, practical and heavy. Willow didn't understand the words, only the tone, less threat than caution. Ethan nodded once. Their fragile sanctuary now had a clock ticking quietly somewhere beyond the tree line. Henry stepped back to the door, giving Willow one last measured look, more respect than fear in it. "Keep her wild," he added, "and keep her unseen." Then he left, his truck's engine fading down the ridge. The cabin door closed with a soft thud that sounded, to Willow, like a choice made in her favour. In the silence that followed, Willow eased down again, folding herself over her kittens. The danger had brushed close, then passed for now. Ethan returned to his chair, closer than he'd dared sit the first day. The stove's warmth stretching between them. Outside, the mountain glittered clean under the sun. Inside, woman of the wild and man of the cabin shared a thinner distance, bound by the storm they'd survived together. Morning came softer the next day, as if the mountain itself wanted to pretend nothing dangerous had ever stood at this door. Light brushed the frost along the window, reaching for the wall where Willow's kittens usually sprawled in a tangle of sleep and sound. But today, the nest was flatter, too neat, too still. The air felt wrong before Ethan understood why. He crossed the room with that slow, careful step he'd learned from living beside a wild heart. The blanket lay dented with fading impressions, still holding the ghost of recent warmth. One small tuft of fur clung near the edge. The stove hummed low, the cabin otherwise mute. Willow was gone. Both kittens were gone. The window above the sill stood eased a fraction wide. For a long moment he only stood there, hand resting on the back of his chair like he needed help believing the emptiness. He had known, from the first shock of her arrival, that this was never his family to own. Every heartbeat shared under his roof had been borrowed. Still, their sudden absence hit like cold water poured straight through his ribs. He moved to the window and looked out. Dawn painted the clearing in pale blue and silver. Across the crusted snow ran a thin trail of tracks, the wide, steady marks of a bobcat and the lighter, clustered prints of smaller paws tucked close to hers. They led away from the cabin, angling toward the ridge where pines sharpened into shadow. Willow had not vanished like a fugitive. She had walked out the way she'd come, openly, leaving her story written where any eyes could read it. A quiet declaration, this shelter had done its work. The wild would carry itself again. Ethan opened the window wider for a breath, letting cold rush in, listening for one last cry tangled in the wind. Only silence answered. He let the glass fall shut and drifted through the cabin on habit, straightening things that no longer needed to be gentle around frightened paws. The corner where they'd slept still held the mingled scents of smoke, wool, milk, fur. He began to fold the blanket, then stopped. Packing it away felt too close to pretending they had never been real. Outside, the day sharpened into a clearer, harder blue. Ravens passed overhead with rough calls, indifferent witnesses to how quickly lives changed course. Ethan stepped onto the porch, boots creaking in the brittle snow. The tracks were clearer from here, purposeful, unbroken. Willow had left not from fear, but because her young could finally follow on their own feet. He walked the first few yards of their trail, snow crunching softly under his soles, then forced himself to stop. The line between forest and front step had never belonged to him. Following would twist trust into pursuit, turn gift into claim. He stood there instead, hands deep in his pocket, watching where their path disappeared into the dark fringe of trees. A hollow quiet washed through him, the kind that settles after sirens fade or the last door closes. The cabin behind felt larger again, and lonelier, like it had before paw prints patterned his floor. Yet beneath the ache was something steadier, a worn, quiet pride that she had gone strong. Both kittens alive, leaving because she could not, because she had to. Back inside, Ethan laid the blanket beneath the window instead of the corner, smoothing it once with his palm. It became less a bed than a marker, a soft-voiced promise that if she ever needed these walls again, her scent and his welcome would still wait here. He set a small bowl of water nearby out of habit, more ritual than hope. Afternoon light slid low, gilding the ridgeline and turning the frost to brief fire. Now and then he caught himself glancing toward the glass, listening for the soft scrape he knew by heart. Each time the silence held, but it no longer felt empty. It seemed full of something unnamed gratitude, memory, the echo of shared survival stitched into the wood. As evening drew in, clouds bruised the horizon, but no storm gathered. The stove glowed, keeping its measured promise. Ethan sat in his familiar chair facing the window, just as on that first impossible morning. Only now there was no tension in his shoulders. If there was anything in his posture, it was invitation without demand to return. If the wild ever chose, on her own terms, far beyond the tree line, Willow moved like dusk itself, her kittens close at her heels, paws confident on the hardened snow. The world was still harsh, but they were no longer breakable embers. Once, she had carried them through glass and into human warmth. Now she carried them forward on what they'd gained. If her ears tilted briefly toward the distant cabin, no one saw. The trail she left was sure, as if she trusted that door would not close against her memory. The cabin settled into night, wrapped in ordinary wind and fire, though nothing about it was ordinary anymore. Ethan let his eyes soften. The image of amber eyes and small paws bright inside him. Loss and awe lay side by side, and in that quiet blend he finally understood. The miracle was not only that she came through his window, it was that, in leaving, she left him changed in ways he had not known he needed. Spring came to the ridge so quietly that Ethan almost missed the moment winter loosened its grip. Snow slid back into the soil, leaving dark veins of earth and new grass along the tree line. The cabin, once sealed against storms, now breathed with open windows and softer air. Still, beneath every gentle morning, a small part of him listened for claws on the sill. He didn't live in that waiting like a wound. Life folded back into simple rhythms, mending fences, checking the creek, restocking wood, though he barely needed it. Yet, at odd hours, his eyes would catch on the blanket beneath the window, still folded there like a kept promise. He never stepped on it. He never moved it away. Some absences were meant to be honored. On a cool, golden afternoon, he brewed coffee and carried his mug out to the porch. The sky stretched wide and clean. Ridges blew at the edges like old watercolor. The silence felt kinder now, lived in rather than hollow. If this was all that remained memory and the echo of wild eyes, he told himself it was enough. He had been there when it mattered. A faint rustle stirred near the brush line. At first he dismissed it as wind, or a rabbit breaking through leftover drifts. Then came a second sound, deliberate, padded, low to the ground. Ethan set his mug down, not rushing, not daring to hope too loudly. When the shape slid from shadow into light, his breath pulled tight in his chest. Willow stood at the edge of the clearing, her coat sleek, her body filled out with strength instead of strain. No kittens at her side now. They would be old enough to move like ghosts of their own. She held something in her jaws, a plump snowshoe hare, its fur ruffled but clean. For a heartbeat, they simply regarded each other across the thawing ground. She padded forward with the same sure steps she'd used that first impossible day, only slower, unhurried by fear. At the porch, she stopped, ears flicking, reading the air. Ethan did not speak. He did not reach for her. He only stood inside the doorway, hands loose, heart open in that quiet way the wild could understand. Willow lowered the hare onto the worn wood plank. Careful, intentional. It was not dropped like discarded prey. It was placed. A trade returned long after any debt had faded. She lifted her head, amber eyes meeting his through the screen. There was no plea in them now, no desperation, only recognition and something that almost resembled regard. For a suspended moment, the ridge seemed to hold its breath. This was the peak the story had been walking toward, not the night she burst through his window, but this, the day she came back on her own, owing him nothing, and chose to stand in the open anyway. A wild heart acknowledging a human without surrendering a single inch of itself. He stepped onto the porch just enough to nod. A small, human gesture in the broad, wordless language between them. "Thank you," he said softly, though the words were for him as much as for her. Willow's whiskers twitched. She accepted the sound without shrinking from it, then turned her face toward the dark line of trees beyond. With the same quiet grace, she moved away, no dramatic look back, no lingering. She vanished into the timber, the dapple of her coat melting into undergrowth and shadow, the way wild things are meant to leave. But this time, Ethan didn't feel abandoned. The emptiness she left behind felt full, anchored by what she'd chosen to give. He carried the hare inside, not as a trophy, but as proof of a bridge that could exist without collar or cage. Later, he laid a fresh bowl of water by the window, more ritual than invitation now. The blanket stayed where it was, a soft echo of the den they had briefly shared, a reminder that his home had once been trusted with more than his own solitude. As evening unrolled across the ridge, the cabin's lights glowed warm against the deepening blue. Ethan sat by the window with his coffee, watching the forest darken, knowing she was out there somewhere teaching her young to hunt, to listen, to vanish when needed. Their worlds had separated again, as they should, but the line between them had changed forever. In the end, the miracle was simple and enormous at once. A wild bobcat had climbed through his window carrying her baby, and in that stunned silence, everyone, man, ranger, and whatever watched from the trees, had frozen in awe. Not because she was tamed, but because she never was. She had trusted him for a moment, then returned to the wild stronger, and left him with a story that would keep his heart open long after the footprints faded. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.